My wife spent the night out with her male coworkers. She came back at 4 a.m. and whispered, "Don't ask, I didn't." But when she saw who was sitting in our living room the next morning, her jaw dropped. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was some kind of insomniac prophet who saw this coming from miles away. But let me tell you, when your wife stumbles through the front door at 4:03 in the morning looking like she just escaped from a perfume factory that exploded in a martini bar, you don't need a PhD in marital psychology to know something's rotten in the state of your bedroom. I wasn't asleep. Hell, I hadn't been asleep for about 3 hours at that point. And not because I was waking up like some paranoid sitcom husband with trust issues and a drinking problem. No, I was wide awake because I'd already done the math, connected the dots, and basically solved this mystery faster than those nerds on CSI figure out who touched the doorknob. The click of the door was subtle. Real subtle, like she thought she was some kind of ninja assassin who'd mastered the ancient art of not waking up her clueless husband. Spoiler alert, I heard everything. The fumbling with keys that sounded like she was trying to break into Fort Knox with a spoon, the whispered curse word when she dropped something, probably her dignity, and then that theatrical tiptoe across the hardwood floor like she was auditioning for a heist movie nobody asked for. I kept my eyes closed, played dead like a possum at a highway rest stop, and just listened to the symphony of bad choices unfolding in my living room. When she finally made it past the couch, which, by the way, is where I'd been posted up since midnight watching Kevin O'Leary tear apart some poor soul's cupcake business on Shark Tank reruns, I cracked one eye open just enough to catch the full picture. And brother, it was a Picasso of disaster. Sophia had her heels dangling from one hand like trophies from a night she'd never admit to. Her blazer was half on and half off in a way that screamed, "I got dressed in an Uber." And her hair looked like it had been styled by a ceiling fan set to hurricane. But here's the kicker, the real chef's kiss of this whole production. She was whispering to herself, actually whispering the words, "Don't ask," like she was rehearsing her defense strategy or practicing some kind of reverse psychology magic spell that would wipe my memory clean. "Don't ask." That's what she muttered as she floated past me. And I'm using the word floated generously here because it was more like a drunk penguin trying to ice skate uphill. She thought I was asleep. She genuinely believed I'd just snore through this Oscar-worthy performance like I always did, like some oblivious husband character from a bad rom-com who doesn't notice his wife coming home smelling like a cologne convention had a baby cabinet. But here's the thing about assumptions. They make an ass out of you and, well, just you in this case, Sophia. The smell hit me before she even made it to the hallway. Now, I'm not some bloodhound with a supernatural sense of smell or anything, but when your wife comes home reeking of expensive cologne that definitely doesn't come from the discount rack at Target where I buy my deodorant, you notice. This wasn't her usual scent, that vanilla-lavender combo she'd worn since we got married, the one that smelled like responsible adulting and Sunday morning pancakes. No, this was something with notes of, I make 6 figures and I definitely own a yacht or at least know someone who does. It was the kind of cologne that comes in a bottle shaped like a geometric nightmare and costs more than my car payment. And I definitely, absolutely, 100% did not own anything that smelled like that. I watched her disappear down the hallway toward our bedroom, moving with the confidence of someone who thinks they've pulled off the perfect crime. She probably figured she'd shower, climb into bed, and tomorrow morning we'd do our usual dance of me asking, "How was your night?" and her responding with some vague corporate word salad about networking events and team bonding exercises that sounded more like euphemisms from a very specific genre of late-night cable programming. She'd gotten away with it before, or at least she thought she had. All those late nights at the office, those weekend team-building retreats that somehow never included spouses, those emergency conference calls at 9 p.m. on a Friday that apparently required her to leave the house fully made up with heels and that dress she saved for special occasions. But here's what Sophia didn't know, couldn't have known, because she was too busy living in her little bubble of terrible decisions and worse excuses. I'd been awake for hours. Not just tonight, but metaphorically. You know, like I'd woken up from this whole marriage coma about 2 weeks ago when I found a receipt in her jacket pocket from some restaurant I'd never heard of. The Velvet Spoon, which sounds less like a place where people eat dinner and more like a location where murders happen in mystery novels. The receipt was for 2 entrees, 2 desserts, and a bottle of wine that cost more than our first date, second date, and third date combined. And before you ask, no, I wasn't invited to this little culinary adventure. I was at home that night eating leftover Chinese food and watching a documentary about penguins, ironically enough. So, yeah, I'd been doing my homework. I'd been paying attention to the patterns, the little inconsistencies in her stories, the way she'd started password protecting her phone like it contained nuclear launch codes, the mysterious work trips that seemed to coincide with her boss's schedule. I wasn't some jealous psycho tracking her every move. I was just a guy who'd finally decided to trust his gut instead of the woman who used to be my best friend before she became a stranger who shares my mortgage. "Don't ask," she'd said, like those 2 words were some kind of magical incantation that would make me forget how to think critically or notice obvious red flags the size of Texas. Don't ask where you were. Don't ask who you were with. Don't ask why you smell like a Sephora exploded in a gentleman's club. Just don't ask, and we can all pretend everything's fine, that our marriage isn't slowly turning into one of those true crime podcasts where everyone listening at home is screaming at the husband to wake up and smell the infidelity. Well, joke's on her, because I wasn't planning to ask. Asking would require me to pretend I didn't already know the answer, and I'm way too tired for that level of performance art. Asking would give her the opportunity to lie to my face again, to spin some elaborate tale about how Mark from accounting just needed someone to talk to about his divorce and they lost track of time and, whoops, didn't realize it was 4 in the morning. Asking would ruin the surprise I had planned, the beautiful, carefully orchestrated karma bomb I'd been assembling in my head while Mr. Wonderful told some entrepreneur that their business model was dead on arrival. No, I wasn't going to ask her anything. I was just going to sit here in the dark on my couch in my house, sipping my cold coffee and mentally drafting the exit strategy that would make Sun Tzu look like an amateur. Because if there's one thing I learned from 17 seasons of Shark Tank, it's that you need to know when to cut your losses and walk away from a bad investment. And brother, this marriage had become the worst investment of my life. No returns, terrible partnership, a valuation that kept dropping faster than my self-respect every time she walked through that door smelling like someone else's life. I listened to the shower turn on, because, of course, she needed to wash away the evidence, like some criminal mastermind who learned everything she knows from watching How to Get Away with Murder. I imagined her standing under the hot water, probably feeling relieved that she'd made it home without confrontation, without consequences, without having to face the music that was about to drop like a beat at a rave she definitely wasn't invited to. "Don't ask," I whispered to myself in the dark, mimicking her voice. "Don't ask," I repeated. And then I smiled. Not a happy smile, but that cold, calculated smile you get when you realize you're about to win a game the other person doesn't even know they're playing. Because tomorrow was going to be very, very interesting. Tomorrow, I was going to start making phone calls. Tomorrow, the fun would really begin. And Sophia, sweet, careless, cologne-soaked Sophia, had absolutely no idea what was coming. By 7 in the morning, I was sitting at our kitchen table. Well, technically it's still our table, but let's be honest. After last night's performance, I was already mentally dividing assets in my head like some divorce attorney who charges $400 an hour. I was drinking black coffee, not the fancy kind with oat milk and caramel drizzle and whatever other Instagram-worthy garbage people pretend tastes good. No, I'm talking straight-up black coffee. No sugar, no cream, just pure, bitter darkness that matched my mood and my newfound clarity about this absolute dumpster fire of a marriage. If coffee could talk, this cup would have been giving me a standing ovation for finally waking up and smelling the betrayal. Sophia was still sleeping in, which is married person code for hiding under the covers and hoping yesterday's terrible decisions somehow evaporated overnight like they were written in disappearing ink. I could hear her phone buzzing from the bedroom every few minutes. Probably Mark checking in to make sure his little secret was still safe. Probably sending some cowardly texts like, "Did he suspect anything?" or "We should probably cool it for a while." Like they were teenagers sneaking around behind the bleachers instead of grown adults torching a marriage with the emotional intelligence of houseplants. The house itself was basically screaming evidence at me, louder than a prosecutor on one of those courtroom TV shows my mom watches religiously. I'm talking about clues so obvious that even Scooby-Doo could have solved this mystery without Velma's help. And that dog survives on literal snacks and cowardice. First up, 2 wine glasses in the sink. Now, before you jump in with, maybe she had a friend over, let me stop you right there, because Sophia doesn't have friends who visit at midnight on a Tuesday. Her friends are all married with kids and mortgages and bedtimes that would make senior citizens look like party animals. These glasses still had lipstick on the rim. One shade I recognized as hers, that mauve color she bought from Sephora and won't shut up about. And another shade that definitely wasn't from any makeup bag in this house. Strike one. Then there was the missing phone charger situation. See, we've got this basket on the kitchen counter where we keep all our charging cables, because Sophia is one of those organizationally obsessed people who labels everything like we're running a small business out of our living room instead of just, living. Her work laptop charger was there, her iPad cable was there, but her iPhone charger, the white Apple one she guards with her life because she claims the off-brand ones ruin the battery, even though I've tried explaining that's not how electricity works, was gone. Vanished. Probably sitting on some nightstand that isn't mine, charging next to a phone that's been texting my wife messages I'm definitely not supposed to see. And the perfume. Oh man, the perfume. I'm not exaggerating when I say you could have fumigated a small house with the amount of scent lingering in our entryway. It was everywhere, on the coat rack, hovering near the couch, probably embedded in the carpet fibers like some kind of aromatic crime scene evidence. This wasn't her usual smell, and it definitely wasn't mine, unless I'd suddenly started moonlighting as a cologne model who shops exclusively at stores where they greet you with champagne. This was expensive. This was deliberate. This was the olfactory equivalent of a signed confession. But here's where it gets really good, folks. Where my inner detective decided to upgrade from suspicious husband to forensic accountant with a vendetta. I opened our shared banking app because nothing says healthy marriage built on trust and communication quite like joint checking accounts and matching debit cards that track each other's spending habits like some dystopian surveillance system we willingly signed up for. I know. Some of you are probably thinking that's an invasion of privacy. And you're absolutely right, except we both agreed to this setup 3 years ago when Sophia convinced me it would help us budget better and stay financially transparent. Well, transparency works both ways, sweetheart. I scrolled through yesterday's transactions with the dedication of an IRS agent who suspects tax fraud and really needs a win this quarter. Coffee at Starbucks, 7:15 in the morning. Okay, normal. Lunch at that salad place she loves because apparently eating leaves makes you morally superior? Fine, whatever. Gas station, 3:30 p.m. Boring, but necessary. And then, right there at 11:47 p.m., like a neon sign flashing, "Your wife is a lying liar who lies," a charge for $173 at a place called The Velvet Spoon. The Velvet Spoon. Let me paint you a picture of this establishment, because I looked it up immediately on Google like any self-respecting husband who's about to become single would do. This isn't some casual Applebee's where you go for half-price appetizers and questionable margaritas. This isn't even one of those mid-tier chain restaurants with the fake Italian names and the unlimited breadsticks. No, the Velvet Spoon is one of those upscale lounges downtown where the appetizers cost more than my weekly grocery budget and the drinks come with fancy ice cubes that are somehow artisanal. It's got mood lighting that's permanently stuck on romantic ambience, leather booths that have definitely seen some questionable decisions, and a menu that describes everything in French because apparently English isn't pretentious enough. According to Sophia's previous explanations about this place, because yes, she's mentioned it before in our carefully constructed web of lies, this is where she and her male coworkers just hang out after projects to decompress and network. Just hang out, just decompress, just network, right? And I just hang out at Ferrari dealerships on Saturday afternoons because I enjoy the free Wi-Fi and the leather smell, not because I'm fantasizing about a life where I can afford things that cost more than my kidneys are worth on the black market. $173 at midnight on a Tuesday? For what exactly? Let me do the math here because I've got nothing but time and spite fueling my calculations right now. That's probably 2 overpriced entrees at about $40 each, maybe some appetizers because you can't just sit at a fancy restaurant without ordering the truffle fries or whatever gentrified nonsense they're pushing, and definitely a bottle of wine, not a glass, a bottle, because nothing says purely professional relationship like sharing fermented grapes that cost more than most people's car insurance. I sat there, staring at that transaction like it was some kind of abstract art I was trying to interpret, except the meaning was pretty damn clear, and it wasn't open to subjective interpretation. My wife had spent almost $200 at a romantic restaurant at midnight with someone who wasn't me, then came home at 4 in the morning smelling like a cologne commercial and telling me not to ask questions. This wasn't rocket science. This wasn't even community college science. This was elementary school detective book level obvious. The best part? The transaction showed it was paid with our joint account, not her personal credit card, not some secret stash of cash she'd been hiding. Our money. The money we both worked for, the money that was supposed to go toward our mortgage and our bills and our theoretical future together. She'd taken our shared funds and used them to finance her little romantic escapade, like some kind of financial infidelity double whammy. It was almost impressive in its audacity, like watching someone rob a bank and then asking the teller for a receipt. I screenshot the transaction, saved it, backed it up to 3 different cloud services because I've seen enough TV shows to know that evidence has a way of mysteriously disappearing when you need it most. Then I opened up a new note on my phone and started documenting everything. The time she came home, the cologne smell, the wine glasses, the missing charger, the velvet spoon charge. I wrote it all down with the methodical precision of someone building a case because that's exactly what I was doing. This wasn't anger. Well, okay, it was definitely anger, but it was organized anger, strategic anger. The kind of anger that makes spreadsheets and takes notes and doesn't just flip tables like some reality TV star having a meltdown. From the bedroom, I heard movement. She was waking up,
probably checking her phone, probably seeing texts from Mark or whoever else was involved in this circus. I could picture her lying there, rehearsing her story, preparing her excuses, maybe even convincing herself that she hadn't done anything wrong, that this was somehow my fault for not being attentive enough or exciting enough or whatever justification cheaters tell themselves to sleep at night. I poured myself another cup of coffee and smiled. Not a happy smile. I was way past happy at this point. But that cold, calculated smile you get when you're holding all the cards and the other players don't even know the game has started. Sophia thought she was so clever, so careful, so good at covering her tracks. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated me. She'd assumed I was the same oblivious husband I'd been for the past year, the guy who nodded and smiled and believed every word she said. But that guy? He died somewhere around 4:03 this morning. And the person sitting here drinking bitter coffee and screenshotting banking transactions, he was someone new. Someone who was done being played. Someone who was about to flip this entire script and watch the dominoes fall exactly where he wanted them to. Game on, Sophia. Game on.
So here's the thing about rage. When it's fresh and hot, it makes you do stupid things like punch walls or send texts you can't take back or eat an entire pizza by yourself at 3 in the morning while crying to Adele songs. But when you let it simmer overnight, when you let it cool down and crystallize into something sharp and purposeful, that's when it becomes dangerous. That's when it becomes useful. And sitting there at my kitchen table with my second cup of nuclear-grade black coffee and a phone full of screenshots that could end a marriage faster than you can say irreconcilable differences, I was feeling pretty damn dangerous. I scrolled through my contacts like I was browsing a menu at a restaurant, except instead of picking between burgers and tacos, I was deciding whose life I wanted to ruin first. Okay, that sounds harsh. I wasn't trying to ruin anyone's life. I just wanted the truth, and maybe a little bit of satisfaction, and definitely the look on Mark's face when he realized he'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Except the cookie jar was my wife, and this metaphor was getting away from me. But you get the point. Mark. Mark Henderson. Team lead Mark, as Sophia always called him, with this weird mixture of respect and something else I couldn't quite identify, but now realized was probably attraction disguised as professional admiration. She talked about this guy constantly. Mark says we should pivot our strategy. Mark thinks I should lead the next presentation. Mark gave me really great feedback on my quarterly report. I'd heard the name Mark so many times in the past 6 months that I was starting to think she'd forgotten mine. And here's the kicker. She always described him as just a friend who gives great feedback, like he was some kind of corporate life coach, instead of what he actually was, which was apparently the guy she was staying out until 4 in the morning with while spending my money on overpriced wine. I found his number in my phone. Yeah, I had his number because Sophia had given it to me months ago in case of emergency, and I needed to reach her through work. The irony wasn't lost on me. This definitely qualified as an emergency, just not the kind she'd been thinking of when she programmed his contact info into my phone with a little briefcase emoji next to his name, like he was some kind of professional connection instead of a homewrecker in a button-down shirt. It was 8:30 in the morning, early enough that he'd be awake, but late enough that he couldn't claim he was still sleeping and couldn't talk. Perfect timing for an ambush, really. I hit the call button before I could overthink it and listened to it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. For a second, I thought he might not answer. Maybe he'd seen my name on his caller ID and panicked. Maybe he was too busy deleting incriminating texts or Googling what to do when your affair partner's husband calls you. But then he picked up. Hello? His voice sounded rough, scratchy, like he'd gargled gravel for breakfast. Hung over.
The man was definitely hungover, and somehow that made me smile, because it meant last night had been exactly what I thought it was.
"Oh, hey man," he continued when I didn't immediately respond, probably trying to sound casual and failing miserably. Sophia around? Sophia around? Like we were college roommates and he was calling to see if his buddy could come out and play? Like he hadn't been out with her until 4 in the goddamn morning, doing God knows what, at a restaurant that probably has sommeliers and cloth napkins, and waiters who describe the specials in voices that sound like they're narrating nature documentaries. I took a slow sip of my coffee, let the silence stretch out just long enough to make it uncomfortable. "Nope," I said finally, keeping my voice light and friendly, like we were talking about the weather or sports scores or anything other than the fact that he'd been playing hide the salami with my wife. "But sounds like you two had fun at the Velvet Spoon." Dead silence. And I mean dead. Like if silence could die and then have a funeral and then be buried 6 feet under, that's how dead this silence was. I could literally hear him stop breathing on the other end of the line. I could practically hear his brain short-circuiting as it tried to compute how I knew about the restaurant, what else I knew, whether he should confess or deny, or just hang up and change his name and move to Canada, where my jurisdiction presumably didn't reach. You could hear his soul buffering, like watching a computer trying to load a program that's too big for its processor. Just that spinning wheel of death going round and round while everything freezes. It was beautiful. Honestly, if I could have bottled that silence and sold it, I could have retired. He stammered, and I imagined him sitting there in his probably expensive apartment with his probably expensive coffee maker and his probably expensive guilt, trying to figure out what lie would work here, what excuse would make this okay. It was just team bonding. Team bonding? This man really looked at his options, surveyed all the possible responses he could give, and landed on team bonding, like that was somehow going to fly. Like I was going to hear those 2 words and suddenly forget that team bonding happens at bowling alleys and mini golf courses and maybe office happy hours that end at 7 p.m., not at midnight at restaurants where the appetizers cost more than most people's monthly Netflix subscription. I smiled. Couldn't help it, really. "The audacity is almost impressive," I said, my voice dripping with enough sarcasm to fill an Olympic-sized pool. "I'm sure it was a very collaborative project." I stretched out the word collaborative like I was savoring it, let it hang in the air between us, loaded with all the implications I wasn't saying out loud. Because here's the thing, I didn't need to spell it out. He knew exactly what I was implying. He knew that I knew, and now he knew that I knew that he knew. And we were caught in this weird loop of knowing things that made the whole conversation feel like some kind of psychological thriller, where everyone's playing chess, except one person doesn't realize they're already in checkmate. "Listen, man, I can explain," he started, but I cut him off. "Can you, though?" I asked, still sipping my coffee like I had all the time in the world and zero concerns about where this conversation was going. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty straightforward. Expensive restaurant, late night, my wife coming home at 4 a.m. smelling like your cologne. I mean, I'm no detective, but even I can connect those dots, and I barely passed geometry in high school. Another pause, shorter this time, but somehow more desperate. I could hear him breathing faster now, could picture him running his hands through his hair or loosening his tie or doing whatever stressed out corporate dudes do when they realize they've been caught doing something that could get them fired, divorced, if he's married, which I suddenly realized I didn't even know and didn't care, and definitely blacklisted from the husband community. It wasn't. He was really struggling here.
And part of me, a small, petty part that I'm not particularly proud of, but also not particularly ashamed of, was enjoying watching him squirm through the phone line. Look, you've got the wrong idea about— Do I? I interrupted again, because honestly, his excuses were boring me, and I had other calls to make. Because my wrong idea includes bank statements, timestamps, and physical evidence. So unless you're about to tell me that you and Sophia were actually conducting a very thorough market research project that required wine pairings and perfume testing, I think my idea is pretty accurate.
Silence again. But this time it was different. This was the silence of surrender, of a man who'd run out of lies and excuses and was finally facing the reality that he'd been caught. I could practically feel his panic through the phone, could imagine him calculating how bad this was going to get, whether I was going to tell his boss, whether I was going to do something crazy. Spoiler alert, I wasn't going to do anything crazy. I was going to do something calculated, which is actually way scarier. "I have to go," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, smiling into my coffee cup. "I figured you might. Oh, and Mark, you might want to update your LinkedIn. Something tells me your collaborative working relationship with Sophia is about to get a lot less collaborative." He hung up. Didn't say goodbye, didn't try to explain further, just clicked off like his phone had suddenly become radioactive. The call ended with that little beep that sounded weirdly final, like the closing bell at a boxing match or the gavel at a trial. Round 1, me. Knockout, also me. I set my phone down on the table and stared at it for a second, feeling something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but wasn't quite anger either. It was more like clarity, purpose. The first domino had fallen, and I could already see how the rest of them were going to tumble down in this beautiful, terrible chain reaction that I was orchestrating from my kitchen table in my pajamas while drinking coffee that tasted like liquid revenge. From the bedroom, I heard the shower turn off. Sophia would be getting ready soon, probably putting on her work clothes and her work face and all the other armor she wore to pretend everything was fine. She'd come out here eventually, kiss me on the cheek like nothing happened, maybe ask what I wanted for dinner, like we were still playing house instead of starring in the world's most predictable infidelity drama. But I wasn't done making calls, not even close. Because if there's one thing I learned from watching too many crime documentaries at 2 in the morning, it's that you need more than one witness, more than one piece of evidence, more than one domino falling. You need a whole cascade. You need overwhelming proof. You need the kind of ammunition that leaves no room for denial or excuses or "it wasn't what it looked like." I pulled up another contact in my phone, one Sophia had no idea still existed, one she'd forgotten about because she'd gotten too comfortable, too careless, too confident that she'd covered all her bases. I smiled again, that cold, calculated smile that was becoming my new default expression, and started dialing. The game wasn't just on anymore. The game was about to go nuclear. The second call I made wasn't to some coworker or mutual friend or anyone in Sophia's immediate orbit. No, I was thinking bigger, way bigger. I scrolled past about 50 contacts until I landed on the name that made me smile for the first time all morning with something that actually resembled genuine happiness instead of that bitter, vengeful satisfaction I'd been running on since 4 a.m. Uncle Frank. Detective Frank Cooper, retired legend, absolute menace to criminals and family drama alike, and the only person in my contact list who'd probably been waiting his entire retirement for someone to call him with a problem this juicy. Let me tell you about Uncle Frank, because the man deserves his own true crime podcast. He spent 32 years with the Metro Police Department, made detective at 28, which apparently was some kind of record.
and spent the next 3 decades solving everything from burglaries to homicides with the kind of success rate that made his colleagues either worship him or hate him, depending on whether they were on his team or competing for promotions. He retired 5 years ago, at 55, because he said he'd seen enough of humanity's garbage to last 3 lifetimes and wanted to spend his golden years fishing and not getting shot at, which seemed like reasonable life goals, honestly. But here's the thing about Uncle Frank. Retirement didn't retire him. The man still thought like a detective, still talked like a detective, still walked around his house wearing reading glasses attached to those dorky chains like he was constantly ready to investigate something. He treated every family gathering like a cold case, asking questions about everyone's lives with the kind of intensity that made Thanksgiving dinner feel like an interrogation. "How's work, Stephen?" wasn't just small talk, it was an opening statement. "You seem stressed lately" wasn't concern, it was him gathering evidence. The man couldn't turn it off, even if he wanted to. And honestly, I don't think he wanted to. I hit his contact and he picked up on the first ring. Of course he did. It was 8:45 a.m. on a Wednesday, which for normal retirees meant coffee and morning news, but for Uncle Frank meant he'd already been awake for 3 hours, gone for a run, read 2 newspapers, and was probably halfway through organizing his tackle box or whatever detective-obsessed retirees do with their free time. "Morning, Frank," I said, trying to sound casual and probably failing because my voice had that edge to it that happens when you've been awake too long and consumed too much caffeine and discovered your wife's been cheating on you.
"Mornin'." His voice came through the speaker like gravel in a blender, rough and direct and completely devoid of the polite cushioning most people use in conversations. "It's 8:45. That's brunch time for drama. What happened?" See, this is why I loved Uncle Frank. No "how are you doing?" no "what's new?" just straight to the point. Like he already knew I wasn't calling to chat about the weather or his tomato garden or whatever wholesome topics normal uncles discuss with their nephews. He could smell a problem through the phone line, and he was already putting on his detective hat before I'd even explained the situation. I told him everything. The 4:03 a.m. entrance, the cologne that could knock out a small army, the wine glasses, the missing charger, the velvet spoon charge, the phone call with Mark that went about as well as a lead balloon at a helium convention. I laid it all out like I was giving a deposition, and he listened without interrupting once, which, if you knew Uncle Frank, was basically the equivalent of other people giving you a standing ovation. The man had opinions about everything, but when someone was telling him a story, he shut up and listened like his life depended on it. When I finished, there was a pause. Not an uncomfortable silence like with Mark, but more like the pause you hear in movies right before the mentor figure says something profound that changes the whole trajectory of the hero's journey. I could practically hear him processing, connecting dots, building a mental file folder labeled Sophia's Infidelity, the Evidence. Then he whistled, long and low, the kind of whistle that means, "Oh, buddy, you're in it now." "So?" he asked, and I could hear the excitement in his voice, barely contained beneath his gruff exterior. This was what he lived for now, the chase, the investigation, the satisfaction of catching someone in a lie. Retirement had probably been boring him to death, and I'd just handed him a case on a silver platter. "You want me to tail her?" "No," I said, because as much as I loved the mental image of Uncle Frank following Sophia around town like some kind of geriatric spy movie, that wasn't what I needed. I just want to know how to stage poetic karma without going to jail. He chuckled, and it sounded like a lawnmower trying to start. "So, you want results, not revenge." "Exactly," I said, warming up to this conversation more by the second. "Quiet, clean, maybe just emotionally devastating enough that she understands the consequences of her actions without me having to actually commit any felonies." He laughed so hard he started coughing, that deep, wheezy cough that happens when retired detectives, who probably smoked too many cigarettes during stakeouts, find something genuinely hilarious. When he finally caught his breath, I could hear him wheezing out words between chuckles. "You always were the polite assassin of the family," he said, and I could picture him shaking his head with that mix of pride and amusement he usually reserved for when someone did something clever but slightly illegal. "Your mother raised you too nice, but you got that Cooper mean streak buried deep down. I like it." "So, you'll help?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer, because Uncle Frank would rather die than turn down an opportunity to solve a mystery, especially one that involved family and catching bad guys, or in this case, bad wives and their sketchy coworkers. "Help, kid? I'm already planning this out like a military operation. Give me 2 hours." He paused, and I could hear paper rustling in the background like he was already taking notes. "Actually, scratch that. I'll come by tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. Don't eat breakfast. I'm bringing donuts, because apparently that's what detectives do in movies, and I've never actually done it during my entire career, so we're doing this right. Plus, we're gonna need the sugar for energy, because what I'm planning is gonna take some time." "What are you planning exactly?" I asked, suddenly both excited and terrified, because Uncle Frank's plans had a tendency to be either brilliant or completely insane, with very little middle ground. "A surprise," he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "Let's just say I've got some resources you don't know about, some connections that still owe me favors, and 32 years of experience making guilty people squirm. You want poetic justice? I'm about to compose you a whole symphony." "Frank, you can't do anything illegal," I said, feeling like I needed to establish some ground rules before this spiraled into something that would make us both feature prominently in a true crime documentary. "Who said anything about illegal?" He sounded offended, which probably meant he was already planning something that existed in that gray area between legal and technically not prosecutable. "Everything I do is by the book. It's just that I've read a lot of books, and some of them have very interesting chapters most people skip over." Before I could ask what that meant, he continued, "Listen, here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., your place. I'm bringing donuts, coffee, the good stuff, not that gas station garbage, and a folder. You're gonna love this folder. It's gonna have everything we need to make sure Sophia and her little boyfriend understand that actions have consequences, and also that you don't mess with a Cooper family member, because we're petty, we're organized, and we've got too much free time." "What's in the folder?" I asked, genuinely curious now. "Evidence, documentation, photographs if we're lucky, and a plan so beautiful it should be hanging in an art museum. But I'm not spoiling it over the phone. This reveal deserves an in-person audience." He paused again. "Oh, and one more thing. Does Sophia know I'm retired law enforcement?" "Yeah, I think I mentioned it at our wedding," I said, remembering the reception where Uncle Frank had cornered half the guests with stories about his most interesting cases until my mother begged him to stop scaring Sophia's relatives. Perfect. So she knows I've got resources, training, and absolutely no qualms about using both. He sounded positively gleeful now. "This is gonna be good. This is gonna be real good. I haven't had this much fun since I caught that city councilman embezzling from the Parks Department. You remember that? Made the front page. Got a commendation. Good times. Frank, I just want her to know that I know and that there are consequences. I don't need a front-page scandal," I said, trying to rein this in before it became the talk of the entire metropolitan area. Right, low profile. I got it," he said in a tone that suggested he absolutely did not got it and was already planning something that would be the opposite of low profile. "Look, trust me on this. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., wear something comfortable because we're going to be setting up a show, and shows require preparation. Also, clear your schedule for the morning.
Actually, clear it for the whole day. This is gonna be an event. What kind of event? I asked, feeling like I was signing up for something without reading the terms and conditions. The kind where everyone learns a valuable lesson about honesty, fidelity, and why you don't cheat on someone whose uncle spent 3 decades interrogating people for a living. He chuckled again. Oh, and one more thing. Does Sophia have anywhere she needs to be tomorrow morning?
She usually leaves for work around 8:30, I said. Tell her you need her home by 9. Make up some excuse. Broken dishwasher, contractor coming, whatever. Just get her there. Trust me. And here's the thing. I did trust him. Maybe that made me crazy. Maybe it made me vindictive. Maybe it made me the kind of person my mother would be disappointed in at the next family gathering. But I didn't care. Uncle Frank had never steered me wrong before. And something about the confidence in his voice made me believe that whatever he was planning would be exactly what this situation needed. Okay, I said. 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'll make sure she's here. Attaboy, he said, and I could hear him already moving around, probably pulling out old case files or making phone calls or doing whatever retired detectives do when they're planning operations. Get some sleep tonight if you can. Tomorrow's gonna be fun. The good kind of fun. The justice kind. He hung up without saying goodbye, because Uncle Frank didn't believe in prolonged phone farewells. And I sat there staring at my phone with a smile that was probably borderline concerning. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., donuts, coffee, and apparently a surprise that was going to teach everyone a lesson. I couldn't wait. At exactly 10 a.m., because Sophia's internal clock apparently only worked when it came to waking up late enough to avoid uncomfortable conversations, she emerged from our bedroom wearing sunglasses. Inside, in our house, like she was some kind of celebrity trying to avoid paparazzi at the grocery store. Except the only person here was her husband, who'd spent the last 6 hours documenting her infidelity like he was preparing for a TED Talk on betrayal. The sunglasses were designer, obviously, some brand I couldn't pronounce that probably cost more than my first car and came in a case that was nicer than my wallet. She wore them perched on her face like armor, like if she couldn't see me clearly, then somehow I couldn't see her clearly either, which is not how vision or guilt works. But hey, I wasn't going to interrupt your delusion. Not yet, anyway. I had plans, and those plans required me to play along with this charade for exactly one more day. Morning, I said from my position at the kitchen table where I'd been sitting for the past 2 hours, scrolling through my phone and absolutely not researching divorce attorneys in our area. Okay, fine, I was totally researching divorce attorneys. But in my defense, it's called being prepared, it's called due diligence, it's called when your wife comes home at 4 a.m. smelling like another man's cologne, maybe you start thinking about your legal options. She stretched, actually stretched, like she was in some kind of yoga video, arms above her head, making this little sound that was probably supposed to be cute but just came across as theatrical, and yawned so wide I could see her back molars. "Morning," she mumbled back, her voice still scratchy from sleep or wine or lies, probably all three mixed together in some unholy cocktail of consequences she hadn't faced yet. "Rough night?" I asked, keeping my voice light and conversational, like I was asking about the weather or her opinion on what we should watch on Netflix later. Like I hadn't spent the entire night cataloging evidence and making phone calls and planning her emotional destruction with the retired detective who was probably right now sharpening his metaphorical knives in preparation for tomorrow's main event. "The team had a few drinks," she said, shuffling toward the coffee maker like a zombie in designer pajamas. She said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, like "the team had a few drinks" was a complete explanation for coming home when most people are waking up for their morning jog. Like a few drinks somehow justified spending $173 at a restaurant that has sommeliers and requires reservations 3 weeks in advance. I watched her pour coffee into her favorite mug, the one that said "World's Best Wife" that her mom got her last Christmas.
And wow, the irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife and serve it at the velvet spoon with a side of betrayal. She added cream, 2 sugars, stirred it exactly 12 times counterclockwise because she was one of those people with weird routines she claimed helped her focus but really just made her predictable. Must have been a long few drinks, I said, still playing the role of oblivious husband, even though every fiber of my being wanted to slam my hand on the table and yell, "I know everything," like some dramatic reveal in a courtroom drama. "You came home after the moon clocked out." She laughed, actually laughed, this nervous little sound that came out wrong, like a car trying to start in cold weather. "Don't be dramatic," she said, waving her hand dismissively like my concern about her whereabouts was just me being silly, just me being one of those overly attached husbands who thinks his wife should come home at reasonable hours and not smell like a cologne commercial. "Oh, I'm not," I said, taking a sip of my own coffee and maintaining eye contact over the rim of my mug like we were in some kind of staring contest, except she couldn't see my eyes because of her ridiculous sunglasses. "Drama needs an audience. I'm just documenting." The words came out before I could stop them, and I saw her freeze for just a second, just a fraction of a moment, where her hand paused mid-stir and her shoulders tensed up like she'd heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. But then she recovered, smiled that fake smile she'd been perfecting over the past few months, and went back to her coffee like I hadn't just dropped a hint the size of a billboard.
"Documenting what?" she asked, trying to sound amused but landing somewhere closer to nervous. "My coffee routine?" "Sure," I said, smiling back at her with the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. "Let's go with that." She didn't catch that last part, or at least she pretended not to, which at this point was basically her default setting. Pretend everything's fine. Pretend the marriage isn't circling the drain like water going down after you've flushed something that shouldn't be flushed. Pretend that wearing sunglasses inside your own house is normal behavior for someone who has nothing to hide. She walked over to where I was sitting, leaned down, and kissed my cheek. The universal sign for, please don't check my texts, please don't ask questions, please just let me get away with this because confrontation is uncomfortable and I'm really good at avoiding uncomfortable things. Her lips were cold from the air conditioning, and her perfume was back to normal, that vanilla-lavender combo that used to smell like home, but now just smelled like someone trying to cover up evidence. "I've got to get ready for work," she said, pulling back and heading toward the bedroom like she was escaping a crime scene. "Big presentation today. Mark wants me to lead the client meeting." "Mark?" She actually said his name, just dropped it into casual conversation like it was nothing. Like I hadn't called that man 3 hours ago and listened to him stammer through the worst alibi since the dog ate my homework. The audacity was almost impressive. It was like watching someone juggling chainsaws while standing in a pool of gasoline next to an open flame. Technically impressive, definitely stupid, absolutely going to end in disaster. "Good luck with that," I said, managing to keep my voice neutral even though internally I was screaming. "I'm sure you and Mark will do great together. You seem to work really well as a team." If she caught the emphasis I put on team and together, she didn't show it, just waved over her shoulder and disappeared into the bedroom, probably to pick out an outfit that said professional career woman and not person having an affair with her team lead while her husband plans her public humiliation with a retired detective. I listened to her get ready, the shower turning on, the blow dryer, the opening and closing of drawers and closet doors. Normal morning sounds that would have been comforting a week ago, but now just sounded like the ticking of a clock counting down to tomorrow morning, when Uncle Frank would show up with his folder and his donuts and his 32 years of experience making guilty people squirm. She emerged 20 minutes later, fully dressed, fully made up, looking like the successful corporate professional she presented to the world. Hair perfect, makeup perfect, outfit perfectly pressed and coordinated.
She looked good. I had to give her that. She looked like someone who had their life together, not like someone whose life was about to fall apart in spectacular fashion because they thought they were smarter than they actually were. "I'll be home around 6, she said, grabbing her bag and her keys, checking her phone one more time before heading to the door. "Want me to pick up dinner?" The question was so normal, so domestic, so absolutely ridiculous given the circumstances that I almost laughed. She was asking about dinner, like we were still playing house, like we were still that couple who coordinated meals and talked about our days, and pretended that everything was fine when clearly nothing was fine and hadn't been fine for months. "Sure," I said, because what else was I supposed to say? "Whatever you want." She smiled, that fake smile again that didn't reach her eyes. That smile that said, "I'm glad we're okay," when we were absolutely not okay and would never be okay again. "Great, love you." She threw it out there like a grenade disguised as affection. Those two words that used to mean something, but now just sounded like a lie, wrapped in routine, wrapped in desperation. She didn't even wait for me to respond before she was out the door, keys jingling, heels clicking on the driveway, cars starting up and pulling away like she was escaping. I watched her drive off from the kitchen window, watched her disappear down the street toward her office, where she'd spend the day working with Mark and probably texting him about how her clueless husband didn't suspect anything, how they were safe, how they could keep this going as long as they were careful. Except they weren't safe, not even a little bit. I pulled out my phone and texted Uncle Frank. "Living room, 9 a.m. tomorrow. Bring popcorn." He responded immediately. "Already got a bag of the good stuff. Movie theater butter. This is going to be better than cable." I smiled, a real smile this time, not the fake ones I'd been giving Sophia all morning. Tomorrow was going to be spectacular. Tomorrow was going to be the kind of confrontation that people talk about for years. The kind of justice that felt earned, deserved, and perfectly orchestrated. Tomorrow, Sophia was going to learn that you can't just say "don't ask" and expect the questions to disappear. Tomorrow, she was going to learn that wearing sunglasses inside doesn't make you invisible. Tomorrow, she was going to learn that the husband she thought was too dumb to notice was actually smart enough to build a case that would make Perry Mason proud.
But today I was just going to sit here, drink my coffee, and enjoy the calm before the storm. Because the storm was coming. Oh boy, was it coming. And it was going to be beautiful. I started cleaning the house like a man possessed, like I was preparing for company, which technically I was. I vacuumed, dusted, organized, made sure everything was perfect. Because when you're about to stage a confrontation of epic proportions, the least you can do is make sure your living room doesn't look like a disaster area. Even revenge deserves a proper stage. By the time I finished, the house looked better than it had in months. Everything in its place, everything clean and organized and ready for tomorrow's show. I stood in the middle of the living room, looked around at my handiwork, and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., Uncle Frank would walk through that door with his folder and his evidence and his decades of experience. And Sophia, sweet, clueless Sophia, who thought she'd gotten away with it, would walk into the surprise of her life. I couldn't wait. I cleaned that house like Martha Stewart was coming over to film a home improvement segment. Except instead of showing people how to arrange decorative pillows, I was preparing the stage for my wife's complete emotional dismantling. Every cushion got fluffed. Every surface got wiped down. Every piece of clutter got organized into neat little piles that screamed, "A man with his life together lives here," instead of, "A man whose marriage is imploding lives here eating cereal over the sink at 2 a.m. The living room got special attention because that's where tomorrow's main event would take place. I arranged the furniture like I was setting up for an interview show.
Couch facing the armchair, coffee table positioned perfectly in the middle where Uncle Frank could dramatically slide evidence across, like we were in some kind of legal thriller. I even bought fresh flowers for the side table. Because apparently, when you're planning to destroy someone's world, aesthetics still matter. The flowers were lilies, which I later Googled and discovered symbolized renewal and rebirth. And honestly, that felt appropriate. This was going to be my rebirth, my liberation, my congratulations on finally growing a spine moment. I vacuumed twice. Twice. Not because the carpet was particularly dirty, but because the sound of the vacuum was oddly therapeutic and also drowned out the part of my brain that kept asking, "Are you sure about this?"
Yes, brain, I'm sure. When your wife comes home at 4 a.m. smelling like another man and lies to your face while wearing sunglasses indoors like some kind of knockoff celebrity, you can be pretty damn sure about burning that bridge and roasting marshmallows over the flames. By 3 p.m., the house looked like something out of a home design magazine, the kind where everything's perfectly staged and you know nobody actually lives there because real people don't keep their homes this clean unless they're either OCD or preparing for company or plotting elaborate revenge schemes. In my case, it was option 3 with a side of option 2, because having Uncle Frank over meant the house needed to be presentable, and having Uncle Frank over to confront my cheating wife meant the house needed to be immaculate. I even brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the good stuff, not the grocery store brand I usually bought because I'm cheap and caffeine is caffeine regardless of whether it costs $8 or $25 per bag. But this was a special occasion. This was the kind of event that required premium coffee, the kind that comes in bags with names like Midnight Thunder or Smoky Mountain Awakening and tastes like someone liquefied sophistication and poured it into a cup. When you're about to drop nuclear truth bombs, caffeine helps. Good caffeine helps even more. Uncle Frank arrived early. Of course he did, because punctuality was apparently a detective superpower they taught at the academy, along with how to read people and how to make criminals confess through sheer intimidation. It was 8:47 a.m., 13 minutes before our scheduled meeting time, and he walked through my door like he owned the place, wearing his old detective jacket. The jacket was leather, worn in all the right places, and had that look that said, "I've seen things, I've done things, and I'm about to make your life very difficult if you cross me." He carried a folder, not just any folder. This thing was labeled Evidence, Spouses, and Other Criminals in his handwriting that looked like it had been forged in some kind of law enforcement font factory. The label alone made me want to high-five him, but we were professionals here. Well, he was a professional. I was just a guy whose wife thought he was too stupid to notice her affair, which honestly made me want to prove her wrong more than anything else in my entire life. "Nice place," Uncle Frank said, looking around the living room with the kind of appreciation you show when you notice someone's put in effort. "Did it myself," I said, probably sounding a little too proud. "Figured if we're going to stage an intervention/confrontation/emotional apocalypse, we should at least do it in a clean environment." He nodded approvingly, setting his folder down on the coffee table with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred texts or classified documents. "Presentation matters. I've conducted interviews in interrogation rooms that looked worse than most people's garages. You did good, kid." Coming from Uncle Frank, that was basically the equivalent of winning an Oscar. The man didn't give compliments unless they were earned, and even then, he delivered them like he was doing you a favor by acknowledging your existence. "Got everything?" I asked, eyeing the folder like it contained the secrets of the universe instead of just the secrets of my wife's infidelity. He tapped the folder with one finger, and I swear I heard angels singing. Or maybe that was just my imagination running wild with anticipation. But either way, the gesture was pregnant with promise. Receipts, photos, timestamps, GPS data from her phone. Don't ask how I got that, it's better you don't know. And even her boss's parking records from the office garage showing his car was there until 11 p.m. on 3 separate occasions when she claimed she was working late. I blinked. You got all that in less than 24 hours? Kid, I spent 32 years getting information people didn't want me to have. This was Tuesday morning easy. I've had harder cases solving who ate the last donut in the break room. He paused, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out his phone. Oh, and a clip. A clip? I asked, not sure I wanted to know, but also desperately needing to know. He grinned, not a happy grin, but the kind of grin a cat makes when it's cornered a mouse and is deciding whether to play with it first or just end the game. Security footage from the Velvet Spoon parking lot. Nothing explicit, don't worry. I'm not running some kind of surveillance state operation here. But let's just say it shows your wife and Mr. Team Lead getting very friendly by his car. Hugging. Extended hugging. The kind of hugging that would make HR write up a violation report. I sat down on the couch because my legs suddenly felt like they'd forgotten how bones work. I knew she'd been cheating. Hell, I'd known since 4:03 a.m. when she stumbled through the door smelling like a cologne factory explosion. But having actual video evidence felt different. It felt real. It felt like the difference between suspecting someone robbed your house and actually watching the security footage of them walking out with your TV. "You good?" Uncle Frank asked, sitting down in the armchair across from me with the casual ease of someone who delivered bad news to hundreds of people over his career and had learned to spot when someone was about to lose it. "Yeah," I said, even though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Just processing." "Take your time. We've got," he checked his watch, an old-school analog thing that probably cost less than Sophia's sunglasses but had more character than her entire wardrobe. "About 8 minutes before showtime. You want to see the footage first or wait for the live reveal?" I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Live reveal. I want to see her face when she realizes she's been caught. Uncle Frank nodded like I'd just given the correct answer on a game show. Good choice. Always better to have the audience experience the evidence in real time. Creates more impact. More, what's the word the kids use these days? Drama. No, wait, it creates more tea. I couldn't help but laugh. Here was this 60-year-old retired detective trying to use Gen Z slang and somehow making it work through sheer confidence and the fact that he was about to help me catch my wife in a lie so big it needed its own zip code. "Uncle Frank, you can't say tea and expect it to land," I said, still laughing despite the fact that my marriage was ending and my life was basically a country song without the truck or the dog. "Why not? Tea is tea. It's a beverage. Makes perfect sense." He shrugged, like language was just another puzzle he'd solve eventually through persistence and refusal to accept defeat. We sat there for a moment in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that happens between people who are on the same team and about to execute a plan that's either brilliant or completely insane. The folder sat on the coffee table between us, like a loaded gun, just waiting to go off. "She's not ready for this episode," Uncle Frank said finally, breaking the silence with the kind of understatement that would make British people proud. "No," I agreed, "she's really not." "Good." He leaned back in the armchair, laced his fingers behind his head like he was settling in to watch his favorite movie. "I've been retired for 5 years, and honestly, I've been bored out of my mind. Fishing's great, don't get me wrong, but you can only catch so many bass before you start missing the thrill of catching people and lies. This is gonna be fun." "Define fun," I said, suddenly nervous about what exactly Uncle Frank considered entertaining. "The good kind of fun, the justice kind. The kind where bad people face consequences and good people get closure, and everyone learns a valuable lesson about honesty and fidelity and why you don't mess with someone whose uncle has access to private investigators, security footage, and a Rolodex full of people who owe him favors." He grinned again. "That kind of fun." I nodded, feeling my confidence return like a wave washing over a beach.
This was happening. This was really happening. In approximately 6 minutes, Sophia would walk through that door expecting a normal Wednesday morning, maybe expecting me to ask about her day or tell her I was running to the hardware store. And instead, she'd get Uncle Frank sitting in our living room with a folder full of evidence that could end her career, her reputation, and definitely our marriage. "You nervous?" Uncle Frank asked, reading me like I was a book written in large print. "Terrified," I admitted, but also weirdly excited. Is that normal? Completely normal. You're about to reclaim your power, set a boundary, and stop being the victim in your own life story. That's scary and exciting at the same time. Like the first time you jump off a high dive, or the first time you tell someone you love them, knowing they might not say it back. He paused. Except in this case, you're jumping off the high dive, and she's the water you're about to make a big splash in.
The metaphor was weird, but somehow it worked. I was about to make a splash, a huge splash, the kind of splash that would create ripples for months, maybe years. Uncle Frank checked his watch again. 5 minutes. You ready? I took a deep breath, looked around my immaculately clean living room, thought about the coffee brewing in the kitchen and the folder on the table and the video footage that showed my wife hugging another man in a parking lot at midnight, and nodded. "Yeah," I said, "I'm ready." "Then let's do this." Uncle Frank cracked his knuckles like a concert pianist preparing for a performance. Time to serve up some justice with a side of uncomfortable truth, my favorite meal. At 8:45 a.m., the front door opened with that familiar click that used to mean my wife is home, but now meant the main event is about to start and I have front row seats to the greatest show on earth. I heard her keys jingling, heard her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, those same expensive heels she'd been carrying in her hand 2 nights ago at 4:03 in the morning, and then heard her stop dead in her tracks, like she'd just walked into an invisible wall made entirely of, oh crap. Sophia stood in the doorway between the entryway and the living room, frozen like someone had hit pause on a movie right before the plot twist. She was holding a croissant in one hand because apparently she'd stopped at that bougie bakery downtown that charges $8 for bread-shaped fancy, and her work bag in the other, looking like she'd just invented brunch and was ready to have a casual Wednesday morning before heading to the office to do whatever corporate people do when they're not having affairs with their coworkers. Then she saw us. Uncle Frank was sitting on the couch like a judge at a talent show, except instead of holding up scorecards, he was flipping through his folder with the kind of casual menace that comes from 3 decades of making criminals sweat. I sat beside him, calm as a monk with Wi-Fi and a fully charged phone, holding my coffee mug like it was a prop in a play I'd been rehearsing my entire life for this exact moment. Her jaw dropped, literally dropped like someone had cut the strings holding it up, and her face went through about 17 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, panic, forced casualness, more panic, and finally settling on that classic, "I'm going to pretend this is normal" expression that guilty people wear when they're trying to convince themselves they haven't been caught. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice doing that thing where it goes up at the end, like she was asking a question, but really she was just stalling for time while her brain tried to compute what the hell her husband was doing sitting on the couch with a retired detective at 8:45 on a Wednesday morning, when he should be at work or running errands or doing literally anything besides this. "Team meeting," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee and maintaining eye contact like we were in some kind of Western standoff, except instead of guns, we had evidence and uncomfortable truths. "Didn't you say you like those?" Uncle Frank didn't even look up from his folder, just kept flipping pages like he was reading the morning newspaper and not a comprehensive dossier documenting my wife's affair. "Hi, Sophia," he said. his voice carrying that particular tone cops use when they pull you over and ask if you know why they stopped you. Friendly on the surface, threatening underneath. Zero room for negotiation. Heard you had an interesting night the other day. Must be tiring keeping all those coworkers entertained. He said coworkers the way other people say cockroaches or jury duty, with just enough disgust to make it clear what he really meant without having to spell it out. Sophia blinked. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish that had just been pulled out of water and was trying to remember how breathing worked. "You can't just," she started, but Uncle Frank cut her off by doing something so simple and so devastating that I wanted to stand up and applaud. He slid a photo across the coffee table. Not handed it to her, not walked it over. Just slid it across the table, like a dealer dealing cards in a poker game where all the hands were terrible and everyone was about to lose their mortgage. The photo landed perfectly in the center of the table, face up, clear as day, damning as hell. It was Sophia at the Velvet Spoon, sitting at a corner booth that probably cost extra because it was romantic or private or whatever euphemism fancy restaurants use for good place to have an affair. She was laughing in the photo, head thrown back, wine glass in hand, looking happier than I'd seen her look in months. And there, right next to her with his hand on her waist like he owned the place and the woman, was Mark. Mark from accounting. Mark who gives great feedback. Mark who was apparently also great at publicly displaying affection with other people's wives in upscale restaurants while spending their money. Sophia gasped. Actually gasped, like someone in a soap opera who just found out their evil twin was real. Her face went pale. Not regular pale, but that specific shade of pale that happens when all the blood drains from your face because your brain needs it more to process the fact that you've been completely, totally, undeniably caught. I sipped my coffee. The moment was too perfect to rush. This was art. This was justice. This was better than any revenge movie I'd ever seen, because this was real, and it was happening in my living room, and I had premium coffee in a front row seat. "That's," she started, but her voice cracked like thin ice under too much weight. "That's not what it looks like." "It's not what it looks like?" Uncle Frank replied helpfully, finally glancing up from his folder with the kind of expression that said he'd heard that excuse approximately 8,000 times in his career and it hadn't worked once. "Because it looks like you and Mr. Team Lead here," he tapped Mark's face in the photo, "having a very cozy dinner at a very expensive restaurant at a very late hour. But hey, what do I know? I only spent 32 years investigating people who lie for a living." He slid another photo across the table. This one showed Sophia and Mark outside in the parking lot, standing by his car. A BMW, naturally, because of course the guy having an affair with my wife drove a car that cost more than most people's annual salary. They were hugging. Not a friendly good-night see-you-at-work hug, but a full-body, arms wrapped around each other, faces buried in each other's necks kind of hug that lasted way longer than any professional relationship required. "Extended team bonding?" Uncle Frank asked, his voice dripping with more sarcasm than my coffee had caffeine. "Very thorough, very hands-on. I'm sure HR would be fascinated by your approach to workplace collaboration." Sophia's croissant fell out of her hand, just dropped straight to the floor like her grip on reality, landing with a sad little thud that somehow perfectly captured the mood of this entire situation. She didn't even notice. She was too busy staring at the photos, at Uncle Frank, at me, like she was a computer trying to process too much information at once and about to crash. "I can explain," she whispered, finally finding her voice buried somewhere beneath the panic and the realization that her carefully constructed lies were crumbling faster than her overpriced pastry on our clean floor. I leaned back on the couch, crossed my arms, and smiled. Not a nice smile. This smile had teeth, metaphorically speaking, and those teeth were sharp and ready to bite. "You could," I said, letting the words hang in the air like smoke.
But remember what you said 2 nights ago when you came home at 4 in the morning, smelling like a cologne commercial? Remember your exact words?" She stared at me, face still pale, eyes wide, looking like she was desperately trying to remember what she'd said while simultaneously trying to unsay it. "Don't ask," I supplied, my voice calm and cold and absolutely done with all of this. "You said, 'Don't ask.' So you know what? I'm just following instructions." Uncle Frank chuckled, that low, rumbling sound that came from deep in his chest, and somehow managed to fill the entire room with judgment. He leaned back, completely relaxed, looking like a man who was enjoying the best entertainment he'd had in 5 years of retirement. "My work here's done," he said. But he didn't move. He just sat there grinning, watching Sophia try to form words that wouldn't come. I reached into my pocket, slowly, deliberately, milking this moment for everything it was worth, because I'd earned this, I'd planned this, and I was going to savor her every single second. I pulled out an envelope. Not just any envelope, but a nice one, the kind you use for important documents or wedding invitations, or, in this case, divorce papers. The envelope was crisp, white, official-looking. I'd labeled it in my best handwriting, Performance Review, Marriage Edition. I held it out to her, arm extended, the envelope hanging in the space between us like a white flag, except, instead of surrendering, I was declaring victory. "Here," I said, "since you're so into workplace feedback and professional development, I thought you might appreciate this." Sophia didn't take it, just stared at it like it was a live snake or a subpoena or something else that could bite her if she touched it. Her hands were shaking. I could see them trembling by her sides, still holding her work bag like it was the only thing keeping her grounded to reality. "What is that?" she asked, even though I was pretty sure she already knew, or at least suspected, because I wasn't exactly being subtle with the Performance Review Marriage Edition label. "Divorce papers," I said, simply. No drama, no yelling, just stating facts like I was reading from a grocery list. Neatly printed, properly filed with the county clerk's office yesterday afternoon while you were at work, labeled appropriately, because I figured if you appreciate feedback so much, you should definitely appreciate this. She looked up at me, her eyes starting to water in that way that meant tears were coming. The kind of tears that guilty people cry when they finally realize actions have consequences, and those consequences have addresses and legal documentation. "You're ending it," she whispered, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing, like the possibility of her husband actually growing a spine and standing up for himself had never occurred to her in all the months she'd been lying to my face. I grinned. Couldn't help it. Really, the question was so absurd, so perfectly encapsulated everything that was wrong with her perspective on this entire situation that I had to smile, or I would have laughed, and laughing felt too generous for this moment. "Just giving the performance review your behavior deserved," I said, still holding out the envelope like an offering or a threat or both. 0 stars. Would not recommend. Terrible communication, dishonest practices, inappropriate workplace relationships, and frequent violations of the basic terms and conditions outlined in our original agreement. Overall rating, terminated, effective immediately. Uncle Frank actually snorted at that, covering his mouth with his hand like he was trying to maintain professional decorum but losing the battle. "Kids got jokes," he muttered to himself, shaking his head with what looked like genuine pride. Sophia stood there speechless, the tears now officially falling down her cheeks, mascara starting to run because apparently she hadn't invested in the waterproof kind. Rookie mistake when you're living a double life that's bound to implode eventually. She looked at the envelope, at me, at Uncle Frank, back at the photos on the table showing her own betrayal immortalized in high-definition color. "This isn't fair,"
she finally managed to say, which was possibly the most tone-deaf thing she could have said given the circumstances, but also perfectly in character for someone who'd been cheating for months and thought she deserved sympathy. "You're right," I agreed, nodding like she'd made a valid point. "It's not fair. It wasn't fair when you lied to me for months. It wasn't fair when you spent our money on romantic dinners with your coworker. It wasn't fair when you came home at 4 in the morning and told me not to ask questions. So, yeah, we're way past fair at this point. We're somewhere in the neighborhood of consequences, and the property values here are pretty brutal." Uncle Frank stood up, collecting his folder with the satisfied air of someone who'd just closed a case. "Well, I think that about covers it," he said, looking at Sophia with something between pity and disgust. "You kids have fun working out the details. I'm gonna go get breakfast. Real breakfast, not $8 croissants that end up on the floor." He walked past Sophia toward the door, paused, turned back. "Oh, and Sophia, next time you decide to have an affair, maybe don't do it in a restaurant with security cameras. Just some free advice from a professional. You're welcome." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any slam could have been. Uncle Frank didn't actually leave. Of course he didn't. The man had 32 years of experience with dramatic exits that weren't actually exits, and this was apparently one of them. He stood by the door, hand on the knob, grinning like a game show host, except the prize was more emotional devastation. "Actually," he said, turning back around with theatrical flair that would make Broadway jealous, "I think I'll stick around for a few more minutes. This is better than my morning crossword puzzle." He walked back to the armchair and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees like a seasoned interrogator who just remembered he had a few more questions. "Sophia," he said, his voice shifting from sarcastic uncle to full detective mode, "on a scale of 1 to subpoena, how honest are you ready to be right now?" Sophia crossed her arms defensively, tears still streaming, but her expression hardening into something that looked like anger mixed with cornered animal desperation. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking but trying to sound confident. "You had no right to spy on me." "Spy?" Uncle Frank raised an eyebrow. "I prefer the term independent fact-finding mission. And technically, your husband had every right, since you're still legally married and spending joint funds on your little romantic adventures. But sure, let's call it spying if that makes you feel better about getting caught." I couldn't help but jump in. "Yeah, spying would require me to be sneaky. I've got your Uber receipt to the Velvet Spoon, but here we are." Before Sophia could formulate whatever defensive argument she was trying to construct, probably something about privacy or trust or how dare we fact-check her lies, there was a knock on the door. Not a casual knock, but a hesitant, uncertain knock that sounded like someone was really hoping nobody was home, but knew they had to be there anyway because they'd been summoned. I stood up, walked to the door with the confidence of a man who'd orchestrated this entire production down to the minute, and opened it. Standing on my doorstep, looking like he'd dressed in the dark and regretted every life choice that had led him to this moment, was Mark. Mark Henderson, team lead. Mark, just a friend who gives great feedback. Mark, the same Mark from the photos currently spread across my coffee table like evidence at a crime scene, which, technically, they were. His face went from nervous to absolutely white when he saw Uncle Frank sitting in the armchair. Not regular white, we're talking ghost white, printer paper white. I've just seen my entire career flash before my eyes white. His mouth opened and closed a few times, no sound coming out, like a car engine trying to start on a cold morning and failing spectacularly. Am I early?" he managed to stammer, which was possibly the dumbest question he could have asked, given that I texted him at 8:30 this morning with a message that said, "9 a.m., my house, don't be late. We need to talk about your team bonding exercises." He knew exactly what this was, he just hadn't expected the full theatrical production.
I smiled, that same cold, calculated smile I'd been perfecting over the past 48 hours. Right on time, actually. Come on in, Mark. Take a seat. I gestured to the couch next to Sophia, who looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Her face had gone from pale to red to some combination of both that made her look like she was having an allergic reaction to consequences. "You didn't," she whispered, staring at me with a mixture of horror and disbelief.
"Oh, I did," I said, closing the door behind Mark, who shuffled into the living room like a man walking to his own execution. "You brought the coworker to the bar, I brought him to breakfast. Fair's fair." Mark sat down on the far end of the couch, as far from Sophia as physically possible, while still technically being on the same piece of furniture. He looked like he wanted to melt into the cushions or possibly teleport to another dimension where angry husbands and retired detectives didn't exist. Uncle Frank slid the photos across the table again. The same photos, but now with their starring actors present in the room. "So, Mark," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that made grown men confess to crimes they didn't commit just to make the pressure stop. "How's the team bonding going? Looks pretty thorough from these pictures. Very hands-on approach. I'm sure your HR department would be fascinated by your management techniques." Mark looked at the photos, at Sophia, at me, back at the photos. His hands were shaking visibly now, gripping his knees like they were the only solid things in a world that had suddenly gone liquid beneath him. "It was a misunderstanding," he blurted out, the words coming fast and desperate like he'd been holding them in and they finally exploded. It wasn't supposed to." I nodded slowly, sitting down in the other armchair and sipping my coffee like I was watching a nature documentary and not the complete destruction of two people's credibility. "You know what else was a misunderstanding?" I asked calmly. "My marriage certificate. I thought it meant something. Apparently, I misunderstood what 'till death do us part' actually meant. Silly me." Uncle Frank chuckled, pulling out another photo from his folder, this one a screenshot of text messages. I had no idea how he'd gotten those, and honestly, I didn't want to know. The man had resources that probably weren't entirely legal, but were definitely effective. "Want to explain these?" he asked, sliding the screenshot toward both of them. "Because from what I'm reading here, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was pretty deliberate." The room went silent. The kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes they've been caught. The evidence is overwhelming, and there's absolutely no way to talk their way out of this corner they'd backed themselves into. The silence in that room was holy. Not church holy, but more like the moment right before a judge reads a verdict and everyone holds their breath waiting to hear if they're going to prison or walking free. Except in this case, there was no jury, no deliberation, just cold hard evidence, two guilty parties, and a retired detective who looked like he was having the time of his life. Sophia looked at me, her face pale and shaking, mascara streaked down her cheeks like war paint applied by someone who'd already lost the battle. She tried to form words, her mouth opening and closing, searching for something, anything that could possibly make this situation better. Spoiler alert, there was nothing. "I can explain," she muttered finally, her voice barely above a whisper, like if she said it quietly enough, maybe I wouldn't hear it, or maybe the universe would take pity on her and rewind the last 48 hours. I stood up, calm as ever, like I was getting up to refill my coffee instead of ending a marriage that had lasted 5 years on paper, but had actually ended the moment she decided another man's cologne was more important than our wedding vows. I looked down at her, at Mark cowering on the couch like a kid who'd been caught stealing cookies, except the cookies were someone's wife, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a weird sense of relief that this was finally over. "You could explain," I said slowly, letting each word land with the weight it deserved. "But remember what you said 2 nights ago?
Your exact words when you stumbled through that door at 4 in the morning." She stared at me, tears flowing freely now, probably realizing where this was going, but unable to stop it, like watching a car crash in slow motion. "Don't ask," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You said, don't ask. So you know what? I'm just following instructions. I'm not asking. I'm not wondering. I'm not giving you the opportunity to spin another lie or craft another excuse or tell me it wasn't what it looked like, when we both know exactly what it looked like." Uncle Frank stood up, collecting his folder with the satisfied air of someone who'd successfully closed a case. "My work here is done," he announced. "Try not to trip over your excuses on the way out, Sophia. They're everywhere." He walked to the door, paused, and looked back at Mark. "Oh, and Mark, might want to update your LinkedIn. Something tells me your collaborative working relationship with Sophia is about to become significantly less collaborative. Also, you might want to check your employee handbook regarding fraternization policies. Just a friendly tip from someone who's seen a lot of people lose their jobs for less." Mark looked like he might actually pass out. His face had gone from white to green, and I was genuinely concerned he might throw up on my freshly vacuumed carpet. I reached down and picked up the envelope from where it had fallen near Sophia's feet, those same expensive feet in those same expensive heels that had clicked across our floor at 4 in the morning. I held it out to her again, steady as a surgeon with a scalpel. "Take it," I said simply. She looked at the envelope like it was radioactive. "You're really ending it?" she whispered. The question was so absurd I almost laughed. "Just like that," I said, tilting my head, considering her question with the kind of patience you show a child who's asked why the sky is blue. "Just like that. Sophia, you ended it months ago when you started lying to my face. You ended it every time you came home late smelling like someone else. You ended it when you spent our money on romantic dinners with your coworker. I'm just doing the paperwork."
I handed her the envelope. Divorce papers, neatly printed, properly filed, labeled Feedback Form, Marriage Edition. She took it with shaking hands, staring at it like it might bite her. "0 stars," I said, unable to resist one final callback. "Would not recommend. Terrible communication, fraudulent advertising, and severe violations of the service agreement. Overall rating, terminated. Effective immediately. Please vacate the premises within 30 days as outlined in the documents." Uncle Frank was fully grinning now, heading toward the door. Kid's got jokes and legal knowledge. I taught him well. "You didn't teach me any of this," I called after him. "Didn't I, though?" he winked. "See you at Christmas. This story is going to be legendary at family gatherings." And then he was gone, leaving me standing in my living room with my soon-to-be ex-wife, her affair partner, who looked like he wanted to dissolve into the couch cushions, and a sense of closure I hadn't felt in months. Sophia stood there speechless, clutching the envelope, probably running through every scenario in her head, trying to figure out how this had happened, how her careful lies had unraveled so spectacularly, how the husband she thought was too oblivious to notice had actually been 10 steps ahead the entire time. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself another cup of coffee, because why not? I had nowhere to be and all the time in the world now, that I wasn't spending it worrying about where my wife was or who she was with. I turned back to face them, leaning against the counter with my mug. "Next time she mentions a team dinner," I said, looking at the space between them rather than at them directly, "I'll send HR a thank you note for taking out my trash." It was petty, it was mean, it was absolutely perfect. And as I stood there in my clean kitchen, in my soon-to-be solely mine house, drinking premium coffee and watching 2 people realize that actions have consequences, I smiled. A real smile this time, because I was finally, actually, genuinely free.